Welcome to episode 11 of the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, we'll talk about the expulsion of George Santos from Congress and the special election that will trigger, the family members of current and former politicians looking to join them in D.C., and the current state of play in the GOP presidential primary as we close out the year. Here we go. Hello, I'm Jacob Rubashkin, and I'll be spending the holidays in Maryland's 8th Congressional District, which is represented by Congressman Jamie Raskin.
Hi, I'm Erin Covey, and I will be spending the holidays where I spent Thanksgiving, which was in Texas's 31st Congressional District, which is represented by Congressman John Carter, and then Texas's 20th District, which is represented by Joaquin Castro.
And I'm Nathan Gonzales, and I'll be spending Christmas in lovely Northeast Indiana, in Indiana's 3rd District, currently represented by Republican Jim Banks, who will be a United States Senator after these elections.
And Nathan, do you have a favorite Christmas movie that you'll be indulging in over the holidays?
Well, we tend to watch Home Alone a lot. That is a good movie, and the kids love it, and it's pretty timeless. Elf will get a lot of play. One of the ones that I find myself watching on TNT or something all the time seems to be Four Christmases. I don't know if either of you seen that with Vince Vaughn and Reese Witherspoon. It's an underrated, maybe emerging Christmas classic. But have you all seen that?
I can't say that I have.
I remember seeing it, maybe it was on Netflix last night, because I was looking for a holiday movie to watch and did not like any of the options on any of the streaming services. But I had not seen that before. I was like, I don't know what this is.
Well, do each of you have a favorite?
I mean, Harry Potter, Narnia, these are all Christmas movies. The Holiday, Miracle on 34th. There's a lot.
Classic. Yeah. I have a couple kind of more orthodox ones, not capital O orthodox. But I'm a Home Alone 2 guy. I think Lost in New York is pretty great. I am a Die Hard is a Christmas movie believer, so I'll throw that in there. But when I was growing up, we actually had a tradition with a couple of families that we would get together with on Christmas Eve of watching Star Wars, usually episode 5, sometimes episode 6. So for me, I've always associated the last 2 movies of the original trilogy with that time of year.
Interesting. My boys they'd be into that. I'm
And,
struggling for more of a connection, but
episode 5, it takes place on a wintry planet. Everyone is in, cold weather gear. It works. It works. All right. Before we discuss our 3 big stories, though, let's get to a few headlines. So in Alaska, Lieutenant Governor Nancy Dahlstrom launched her bid to take on Democrat Mary Peltola. Dahlstrom is a Republican. She's been heavily recruited by national Republicans here in Washington, D.C., but she may actually complicate efforts to win back this seat. That's because there's another Republican already in the race, Nick Begich, who ran for this seat in 2022, is the grandson of former Congressman Nick Begich, who held this seat a half century ago. And because of Alaska's top 4 ranked choice voting system, the only one of its kind in the nation, the presence of 2 Republicans running against 1 Democrat, Mary Peltola, actually makes it more easy for Peltola to ultimately win a tough reelection.
You know what? I missed Nick Begich when I was going through my Nepo Baby candidate list, so this is a good reminder.
Yeah,
preview
he's
for our
definitely up
future
there.
segments. Yeah. In other unrelated news, Sandy Pensler, who ran for Senate in 2018 in Michigan, and is a wealthy private investment firm owner, is running for Senate again in Michigan this cycle. And he is the 4th candidate, or the 4th prominent candidate, to get in the Republican primary for this open seat, which is getting increasingly crowded and is probably going to be one of the messiest Republican primaries of the cycle. The other candidates are former Congressman Mike Rogers and Pete Meyer, and then former Detroit Police Chief James Craig.
Yikes. And in North Carolina, Republican Patrick McHenry went from interim Speaker of the House to not running for reelection at all in a matter of about 6 weeks. His newly drawn 10th district in North Carolina is solidly Republican, so the big fight will be in the Republican primary. Despite the headlines about the mass exodus from the House, according to my count, we're at about 33 members who have announced they would not seek reelection. The average per cycle is 34, but we still have about 5 months worth of filing deadlines in states, so it's likely we're going to creep above average by the time it's all said and done. The Inside Elections podcast is sponsored by George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management, or GSPM. The GSPM program offers master's degrees in legislative affairs and political management with in person and online class schedules designed for the working professional. As a graduate of the GSPM program, it was exactly what I was looking for. I knew that I wanted to get an advanced degree, but I also knew for sure that I did not want to go to law school. And the master's degree that GSPM provided was more practical than some other advanced degree in political science. So I know it was right decision for me. Might be the right decision for you. So just click on the link and check out what the GSPM program has to offer.
First up, on its third try, the House of Representatives finally expelled embattled New York Congressman George Santos.
2/3 voting in the affirmative, the resolution is adopted, and a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The clerk will notify the governor of the state of New York of the action of the House. Under Clause 5D of Rule 20, the chair announces to the House that in light of the expulsion of the gentleman from New York, Mr. Santos, the whole number of the House is now 434.
The serial fabulist was expelled from Congress on a 311 to 114 vote. That's about 27 votes more than the 2/3 threshold necessary to expel a member of Congress, so not a particularly close outcome when all was said and done. Now there will be a special election to fill the vacancy left by Santos, and this will be the first truly competitive special election of the 2024 cycle.
And it's right before Valentine's Day, right?
That's exactly right. It will make a very nice gift for either House Speaker Mike Johnson or Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries on February 13th, one day before Valentine's Day, when New Yorkers will go to the polls to fill this vacancy. And we are taping this podcast on Wednesday morning, December 6th. We do not know what the candidates are going to be yet, but we anticipate that within the next couple of days, we will have a good sense of who the Democratic and Republican nominees are for this race.
But even though it's not official, you have a pretty good idea who the nominees are going to be, right?
Yeah, so certainly on the Democratic side, it's pretty clear that it's going to be former Congressman Tom Suozzi, who held this seat from 2017 up until this past year, 2023, when he left to run for governor. There had been a moment where it looked like the current governor, Kathy Hochul, might actually intervene and prevent him from winning the nod here. And I should say the way that the nominations work in New York in special election is that there's not a party primary. The nominees are actually handpicked by the county party leadership in any of these districts. In this case, in New York's third's case, the district is predominantly Nassau County on Long Island with a little bit of Queens, but ultimately the decision rested in the hands of one man, Jay Jacobs, who is the chairman of the Nassau County Democratic Party, as well as the chairman of the New York State Democratic Party. Now, Jacobs is close with Governor Kathy Hochul. He's also close with Tom Suozzi. Hochul clearly had a lot of influence in this process because she actually dragged Suozzi up to Albany on Monday to interrogate him about his plans to run for Congress and extract a number of political commitments from him, get him to apologize for the campaign that he ran against her last year in the Democratic primary. And only after that did she give him her stamp of approval to be the nominee for the party. The other Democrat who was in the mix, Anna Kaplan, a former state senator who actually had run against Suozzi in the Democratic primary in 2016 as well. She was the other candidate that was being considered, but it does not look like she'll get the nod this time around.
Wait, did Hochul actually extract an apology from Suozzi?
Yes,
Or is
according
that
to the
was
New York, according to the New York Times, in their meeting at the governor's mansion on Monday, Suozzi did apologize for the way that he ran his 2022 race. It was a total flop, his campaign. He won about 13% of the vote, even worse than he did the last time he ran for governor in 2006 against Eliot Spitzer, when he won 18%. But he apologized basically for insinuating that Hochul was corrupt, among some other political things that he said in the course of that race. And then on the Republican side, it's a little less clear, but it will likely be one of two potential options. There's a retired NYPD detective named Mike Sapriconi, who is already in the race, was running against Santos. And then there's a Nassau County legislator named Mazi Pilip, who has not been running, but was interviewed for this role and is the other potential choice here for Nassau County Republican Party Chairman Joe Cairo.
And no matter who the nominees are, we have this race rated as a toss-up. It's going to be a sprint to February 13th, likely millions of dollars being spent. How important is this race for either the immediate Congress and for the fight for the majority later in 2024?
Well, it's incredibly important for both because Republicans have such a narrow majority right now, 222 to 213. They are going to lose a member when Bill Johnson leaves to take over Youngstown State University. Democrats, of course, are going to lose a member when Brian Higgins leaves. But the reality is very narrow margins, and we're still looking at a year where they have to pass a number of bills. And Mike Johnson clearly has not been able to figure out a way to consolidate his caucus to the fullest extent yet. So if Republicans go down a seat, if we're looking at a 221 to 214, right, all of a sudden that narrows the margin that Republicans can afford on any given vote. So it's important for the immediate implications, but it's also important, of course, for the fight for the majority, especially because Democrats have staked their path to the majority on New York. New York was a disaster for the party in 2022. It was an embarrassment for Hakeem Jeffries, who's now the Democratic leader. They lost 5 or 6 seats that they should have won, given how well they performed elsewhere in the country. So they know that in order to win back the majority next year, they have to reclaim a lot of territory in New York. If they can't win the seat that George Santos was just booted out of, a Biden +8 seat on Long Island with a former congressman running potentially against an untested Republican opponent, if they can't win that race, it says a lot about their chances of being able to win all of those races in New York that they want to rack up in order to get back to 2015, in order to get back to 218, in 2024.
So do we think this is going to be more or less expensive than Georgia 6 was in 2017, given the timeline, and obviously things are more expensive now than they were in 2017 in general?
So what the Georgia 6 was like 40 million all in ultimately, or something like that?
I believe it was 40 million. And it still holds the record for the most expensive House special election.
I think there's a chance this exceeds that, but I think working against it is just the really condensed timeline, right? The thing about Georgia 6 was that it really was 2 elections, because there was that all-party primary that Georgia does for its special elections, where if you win a
Right.
majority, you win the seat. And so there was a real thought that maybe Ossoff could win an outright majority, and then he didn't, and it went to a runoff. So I believe the timeline there was significantly longer. We're looking at just really a couple of months. A February 13th election is 2 months and change. And so there's not as much time to spend money on TV. Obviously, New York TV is incredibly expensive. This district is entirely within the New York media market, but I do wonder whether that will ultimately keep costs lower than that massive special election in Atlanta we saw a couple of years ago, just because there's less time to run those ads.
Yeah, so it was more than 50 million, actually.
Ooh.
So underestimated a bit.
Yeah, I don't know if they'll hit 50. I talked to a few sources over the weekend who were their top end was closer to 40,
Okay.
and between kind of 20 to 40, I think, depending on what the polling data looks like and how much each party ultimately wants to invest, how much they can invest, what resources are available.
I love that range. It could be 20 million or double that. Like, that's quite
What's
quite a
20 million among friends? Come on.
Jacob, do you have a sense of who the strongest Republican nominee would be between those two? And I know there's maybe one or two others who are maybe still in the mix.
Yeah, gosh, it's hard to say. I think that on paper, Mazi Pilip has an incredible story and one that we don't really hear very much coming out of anyone, certainly, but Republican politics. She is her story. She is a Jewish Ethiopian refugee who went from Ethiopia to Israel, joined the Israeli Defense Force, was a paratrooper in the Israeli army, has since come to Long Island, where she's a state legislator. There's only ever been one Black woman to ever serve in Congress as a Republican. So if she were to get the nod and to win, she would be the second. It would be pretty historic. She would be the first Jewish Black woman to serve in Congress, I believe. For a Republican Party that typically on Long Island nominates a certain kind of candidate, she looks pretty different than the status quo there. I think that she is a local county legislator, and it's always a big step up to try and run for a congressional seat, but certainly hear lots of good things about her. Mike Saperconi is kind of the more typical Republican that you might see come out of Long Island. And the reality is, over the last couple of years, they've actually been quite successful with that model. He actually shares a lot of similarities with the congressman in the 4th district, which is due south of the 3rd, Anthony D'Esposito, also an Italian-American retired NYPD detective, originally from Hempstead, which is the town in the 4th district. And D'Esposito won a district that was twice as Democratic by margin as the 3rd district last year. And so I think for Republicans, when you're trying to kind of figure out who you think your best candidate is going to be, both of these options, Pilip and Saperconi, bring very different stories to the table, but both, I think, could wage very credible general election campaigns in this district. While Democrat Tom Suozzi is attempting to win back his old seat, another candidate is trying to win a seat that was once held by his father, and he's not the only one trying to keep it all in the family.
And the other surprise in Texas was in the 26th congressional district, where Dick Armey is retiring after this term, and his son was running to replace him. His son in a runoff with Dr. Michael Burgess. Burgess is a political newcomer, doesn't have a lot of experience in politics. Scott Armey had a lot of money, support. He had the name, of course, running in his father's district.
That was a clip from a 2002 Washington Journal segment on C-SPAN talking about the race to succeed Dick Armey, who was the former majority leader of the House, who retired in 2002. And at the time, his son Scott Armey was expected to succeed him. Armey was a Denton County judge, was in his early 30s at the time, and was seen as the natural successor to his father. But in an upset, Michael Burgess, who was a gynecologist and a total political outsider, managed to defeat Scott Armey in the primary runoff in a race that kind of turned into a race about nepotism. And now 20 years later, Burgess is retiring, and Scott Armey, who is still younger than Burgess currently is running for a second time for his dad's old seat. So some of y'all might remember at the beginning of this year, Jacob wrote a pretty comprehensive piece breaking down all of the congressional Nepo Babies, which you can still read online at InsideElections.com. And in 2024, it looks like a few more candidates with helpful familial connections could be elected to Congress. So this is not comprehensive, but here's a couple of folks that I've been watching. One of them is Scott Armey, who, like I said earlier, is running again for his father's seat, which is in North Texas, in Texas's 26th district. And then Dinesh D'Souza's son-in-law, Brandon Gill, is also running for that same seat. Obviously does not have the D'Souza last name, but those connections are definitely going to be an asset. And then over in Washington, in Oregon, in Oregon's 3rd district, Sushila Jayapal, who is the sister of Pramila Jayapal, is running to succeed Earl Blumenauer in that open race. And then over in Virginia 7, you have Brianna Sewell, who is running to succeed Abigail Spanberger, who's running for governor in Virginia. She is a cousin of Congresswoman Terry Sewell, who represents a seat in Alabama. So, maybe less of an asset there. But then down in Alabama, you also have Shamari Figures, who is the son of 2 prominent state senators in the state. State Senator Michael Figures, the late State Senator Michael Figures, and State Senator Vivian Figures. So those are just a couple. We also mentioned Nick Begich earlier, running again for Congress in Alaska. And then probably the biggest, though not really a Nepo baby, but the biggest potential nepotism storyline in 2024 is going to be Tammy Murphy, who is the wife of Governor Phil Murphy in New Jersey and is running in the primary against Menendez.
So is there any advantage that being a family member of a current or former member of Congress or politician gives any of these candidates in their races?
So it's definitely an advantage. All of the folks that I mentioned earlier all have competitive primaries. So it's not like the name was enough to clear the field for them, but it probably will be enough to put them into the top tier of candidates in some of these races. So like for Army, it's kind of unclear how much weight his last name has, just because his father represented that part of Texas 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now. And it's since then the region has exploded. There has been a lot of dramatic growth in that area. And it's not clear how many people like actually remember who Dick Armey is or would have voted for him back in 2000, which was the last time he would have been on the ballot there. And then with Brandon Gill, obviously, like I said, doesn't have the last name, but he does have connections kind of in the MAGA world because of his wife, D'Souza's daughter. And he also already got Trump's endorsement. So obviously some of those connections are paying off early on in that race. And then in the Oregon race, this is something that I was asking Nathan about earlier. So obviously, Jayapal represents Seattle, and her sister is running for a Portland-based seat. Now, I think Jayapal has a decent amount of national name ID versus your average member of Congress, just because she does lead the Congressional Progressive Caucus and is fairly well known on the national stage as far as a member of Congress goes. But I'm not sure how much of an asset that will be for her sister. And then with some of these other folks, with Figures, I know that his name is really well known in the Mobile part of the new Alabama district. There has been a Figures in the state Senate since 1978. And so that is probably going to be a huge asset for him. But Tammy Murphy probably is going to benefit the most in that contest. And I'll let Jacob talk about that a little more since he's been covering that one.
Yeah, it's been quite incredible to see the Democratic Party establishment in New Jersey line up behind Tammy Murphy in that primary, especially because not only is there, of course, a sitting Democratic senator who still says that, he hasn't said officially that he's running for re-election, but he hasn't said he's not running either in Bob Menendez, who's facing a number of federal indictments, but also there's a sitting Democratic congressman, Andy Kim from the 3rd district, who is also running in that Democratic primary. And yet, even then, we have seen pretty much the entire congressional delegation, short of Bob Menendez's son, Robert Menendez, and Bonnie Watson Coleman. Otherwise, everyone has pretty much lined up behind Tammy Murphy in that race. She has already won support from numerous county party organizations, which in New Jersey actually means something because it gives you preferential ballot placement on all of the ballots in that county. Studies have shown that there is a appreciable impact to having the county party line in New Jersey. And so we have seen a remarkable consolidation among a lot of the establishment around Tammy Murphy as she has entered this race. Andy Kim, though, doesn't seem like he's backing down. He's raising a lot of money. He has won support from a number of national groups, Vote Vets, I believe, and Citizens United, though I'm not sure about that. But he is also a strong contender here. The early polling in the race shows that he starts out with the lead over both Menendez and Murphy. So we'll see if her connections to the governor and to the state's politics are enough to help her pull off an upset.
Yeah, it's key. I think these candidates, maybe, maybe they have higher name ID, but some of them can't because of having a family name. But the ones that we're talking about, right, are in different districts, sometimes different states. But having those connections, maybe give them advantage with donors, right, or give them a second look, or to a smaller class of people who do still recognize the name or that lineage, and so they have an advantage because in crowded primaries, some of the big groups stay on the sidelines, and so raising money and raising your name ID is difficult. But if you have an extra opportunity to get to know donors, then that could give you an advantage in a crowded race.
Yeah. Though we should say, of course, uh, it's not always an advantage, and it's certainly not always a silver bullet. I mean, I remember earlier in the cycle when Laura Pastor in Arizona was considered one of the top candidates for the seat being vacated by Ruben Gallego. And of course, her father, Ed Pastor, held that seat for a while. We mentioned Nick Begich, who lost 2 elections in Alaska last year, a special and a general election, and of course Scott Armey lost that 2002 race. And I read a story the other day that noted that Burgess actually was able to turn Armey's connection to his father into a liability for the
Right.
younger candidate. He actually ran mailers that all they said was, "Michael Burgess, I'm not Dick Armey's son." and that was an effective enough message for him to shock a lot of the political establishment there and beat Scott Armey in the primary back in '02.
So, Aaron, do what races that we just talked about actually matter for the balance of power in the House?
So, probably only one of those races, which is Virginia's 7th district, and also probably the race where the kind of nepotism connection may have the least impact, just because on the Democratic side of that race, that is already a pretty crowded primary, and there's still a couple of bigger names who could run here who have not announced campaigns. And so, yeah, it's kind of unclear at this point, I guess, what Brianna Sewell's chances look like because the field is still in flux. But I mean, the fact that her cousin is in Congress could help her maybe with congressional endorsements and with donors. And so, like you said, Nathan, that connection there is probably going to matter more than the actual last name, just because, Alabama is not close to Virginia, and Terry Sewell is not a particularly high profile member in the House either.
Yeah. And we should say that, Brianna Sewell is an elected official in her own right. She's a
Yes.
member of
Yeah.
the State House of Delegates. She has her own kind of political identity, separate and apart wholly from her cousin. Though I will say the Sewells are also a politically active family going back at least one generation. Terry Sewell's mother was the first Black woman on the Selma City Council back
Right.
in the 1990s. So clearly politics, a big part of the family for the Sewells. And finally, let's check in on the presidential race, where we're just 40 days away from the Iowa caucuses. Crazy to think. And by the time you're listening to this, it'll probably be 39 days. So buckle your seatbelts. Last episode, Aaron and I think both incorrectly guessed that Asa Hutchinson would be the next Republican to drop out of the presidential race. In fact, it was Doug Burgum, not Asa Hutchinson, who is still somehow running for president. Nathan, I think you thought that Burgum would be the next one to drop out when we talked about this last. So I will defer to you on the rest of this conversation on the presidential race, because you've clearly got a better finger on the pulse here.
I don't know. I'm still surprised that Asa Hutchinson is still in the race. I almost forgot that. But aside from Burgum's departure and tonight's Republican debate, the biggest news in the presidential race is probably Governor Ron DeSantis finishing the full Grassley by visiting all 99 of Iowa's counties. And he seems to think that that's going to boost him to the top.
So we went everywhere, we showed up, we took questions, and we've been able to build a really incredible organization. We've got over 30,000 people that already committed to caucus for us. We're adding more every day. Of course, we have the endorsement by the great governor here, Kim Reynolds. If you look at past Iowa caucus winners and compare to what, people were saying in November with this poll or that poll, it almost never comes out the same way.
That was Ron DeSantis this past Sunday on Meet the Press. And a couple things jumped out to me. Rather than finishing the full Grassley being this big accomplishment, I think it actually demonstrates his weakness in the race, because this shows that after traveling to every corner in every county of the state over the last 6 months, DeSantis is either in the same position or worse than he was when he entered the race. Back in early June, he was polling at about 20% in Iowa. When you look at the 538 average now, he's at about 18%, and he hasn't even cracked 20%. He's only cracked 20% in one of the last 11 polls in Iowa going back to August. So Trump remains the clear front runner. I am not convinced that that suddenly, because he finished all 99, that voters are going to suddenly start peeling away from Trump and moving to DeSantis. I think that's a real challenge for him. DeSantis also mentioned that in previous Iowa caucuses, that at this point the polls were wrong. That what they were saying in November was not predictive of the caucuses. And I went back to the most recent competitive Iowa caucus in 2016. And at this point in that election, it showed Ted Cruz a few points ahead of Trump in multiple polls. And Cruz ended up beating Trump in Iowa 28 to 24%. The polls were actually pretty good. And so that's not good news for DeSantis. And also, these caucuses are going to take place 2 weeks earlier than what they were in 2016. They were on February 1st in 2016. It's on January 15th of next year, this cycle. So um, you could tell I'm a little pessimistic on DeSantis' chances. Am I being too pessimistic? You two should correct me. And how many tickets do we think there are going to be out of Iowa?
I don't think so. I mean, like you said, Trump's standing in Iowa has been pretty static. And I mean, as of right now, Haley is only a couple of points behind DeSantis in an average of all the recent Iowa polls. And so I don't think it's clear at all that DeSantis even gets second place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are at least two tickets out of Iowa. Well, okay, I think Trump's going to win the nomination. I think all of this is ultimately a little bit of theater preceding that ultimate conclusion. But I think for the purposes of looking just at the Republican primary, there are two tickets out of Iowa, right? It'll be Trump and then
Asa Hutchinson.
Asa Hutchinson, exactly. No, Chris Christie is going to shock the nation. No, look, I think that there are either two or three tickets. I should be specific. I think if DeSantis comes in second, if it's Trump, DeSantis, Haley, the three of them all move on to New Hampshire. And then, Haley wants to make it to South Carolina. That's her home state. That's where she's polling the best. If she can build up some momentum in the first two states, finish a strong second, maybe in New Hampshire, and try and catapult in South Carolina. That's kind of the theory of the Haley case. If DeSantis finishes in third in Iowa, he's polling about fifth in New Hampshire right now, which seems hard to believe because there are only four candidates, but he's really fallen quite a bit in New Hampshire. If he finishes third in Iowa, I'm not sure how he continues to make his case, because New Hampshire, he's lost a ton of ground. South Carolina, he is well behind Nikki Haley now, especially since Tim Scott dropped out and kind of the hometown support that was with him has largely shifted over to Haley. The Nevada caucuses / primaries are kind of a mess and don't really seem to be very indicative of one way or another. Half the candidates are doing one, half the candidates are doing the other. And then you're at Super Tuesday. And the DeSantis folks for months have been saying, don't believe the national polls. The national polls don't matter. But when it comes to Super Tuesday and you've got a dozen or more states doing their primaries, that's basically a national primary. I mean, if you're behind 30, 40, 50 points in the national polls like DeSantis is, and you're heading into Super Tuesday, what hope do you have? So I think if he finishes third in Iowa, I don't know if he continues, especially that his kind of the superstructure of his campaign, which is this never back down super PAC that's been funding his ad campaigns, funding his bus. He only started driving his own bus in the last couple of weeks. They've basically fallen apart. They've gone through 2 chairmen and 2 CEOs in the last couple of weeks. There's a rival super PAC now. I don't know if he's going to have the capability to outlast a disappointing Iowa finish.
Yeah, and Chris Christie, we were talking about tickets out of Iowa. Chris Christie won't be getting one of those, but Chris Christie is nowhere in Iowa. He's trying to make a big splash in New Hampshire, so I think he'll be, he'll at least try to stay in the race until New Hampshire, and then I don't expect that strategy to go well for him. But yeah, I think DeSantis. Still put another flag in the ground that there's still time for DeSantis not even to make it to Iowa. I mean, this is not going well for him. Aaron, as you said, DeSantis and Haley look about even in the polls, but I view them in the same place but moving in different directions. Right? That DeSantis moving in the wrong direction and Haley moving in the right direction. But is Nikki Haley is the Nikki Haley boomlet? Is it real? Does it end up mattering in the context of this primary?
I mean, I think it's real. I think the harder question is how much it matters. It's real that she is now, I think, probably the more viable second place alternative to Trump in the eyes, at least, of a lot of the anti-Trump donors and party leaders who are kind of on the sidelines right now. And so that does matter, particularly, depending on what happens, I guess, with these trials. And if, I don't know, if there's a chance that somehow something happens with Trump personally and he is not going to be on the ballot in the general election, whoever is in second place would obviously be positioned to be the nominee instead. But that's all speculation at this point. That's why it's hard to really say how much it matters, because at this point, there's still like a pretty slim chance that anyone other than Trump wins the Republican primary.
Yeah, I think it matters within the small universe of who gets second place. But ultimately, I think Haley's problem is that she's not, even if this is her boomlet, she's not anywhere close, right? And we know that most of DeSantis's supporters, maybe not most, but a plurality of DeSantis's supporters, their second choice is Trump. So if DeSantis drops out, if she successfully pushes DeSantis out of the race, all the people who thought of DeSantis as Trump but better, or Trump but more polished, less baggage, those people aren't going to go to Nikki Haley. They're just going to go back to Trump. And so by perhaps her greatest success of supplanting DeSantis as the number 2 option, she's also kind of setting up Trump for a big boost if and when DeSantis drops out. And I think that's what has really gotten under the skin of the DeSantis folks. And I know this because they talk about it publicly, about how Haley doesn't have a mathematical path to the majority, that if DeSantis goes, then there's nobody that can stop Trump. And yet it's that kind of process argument is not one that voters are necessarily finding themselves swayed by, especially the kind of voters that are deciding between Trump alternatives, which is the kind of people that are now gravitating toward Haley away from DeSantis, not the people who want Trump 2.0.
Yeah. DeSantis had a chance. I mean, he had as good a chance as any of the non-Trump candidates. He came, he finished his huge reelection bid, as the most talked about Republican other than Trump. and he blew it. We'll see what happens in the end, though.
And finally, our last segment, Look What I Found, where we highlight something new we've stumbled across. It could be political, sports, music, or something else entirely. You never know what you're going to get. Erin, what did you find this week?
So I was reading the Time Person of the Year article this morning. It's about Taylor Swift, if you're living under a rock. And the funniest part that I found in it was that apparently her song Mastermind, which is kind of a deep cut on Midnight's, her latest album, was inspired by the movie The Phantom Thread, which obviously does not end well. I'm not going to spoil it, but it doesn't end well for the male counterpart in that love story, which I thought was very funny. And I don't know if she was alluding to like something specific with that or just the general idea of being able to manipulate your relationships in interesting ways.
Well, I read recently that Sweet Nothings is apparently about Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney. That might be just a theory. I don't know if that's confirmed or not.
It's a theory. She
It's
liked a
theory.
tweet
Okay, she liked a
that
tweet.
people are
Okay.
reading into.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's more evidence than I feel like there is for a lot of the theories.
It's true.
What did I find? I found a couple of things, but I really got a kick out of a recent New York Times Magazine profile by Katie Weaver of Stephanie Courtney, who I think everyone pretty much knows better as Flo from Progressive, the spokeswoman for the insurance company that has become kind of a ubiquitous face for anyone who's turned on a TV or opened YouTube over the last 12 or 13 years. It's an incredibly funny profile. It's a really interesting kind of portrait of somebody who is both insanely famous, but also completely unknown, as well as someone who, had their life turned upside down basically by a single casting call when they were a struggling comedian. As well as someone who's, defined by being the face of an insurance company now, which is not necessarily what she expected or anyone else thinks of themselves as their calling. But it's in the New York Times. It's a really funny article. It's a good read if you haven't checked it out already.
And I found that I still don't like Mariah Carey's Christmas music. This might caused multiple people to turn off this podcast, but it's because I believe my sister played it on a loop for about 2.5 years. I'm not talking about just Christmas time for 2.5 years. I'm talking about 2.5 years straight. And the wall between our bedrooms growing up was very thin, and it just penetrates my brain in a way that nothing else does. So I don't know. Maybe I'll get over it with time. But it brings, anytime I hear any of those songs, it brings me back to my childhood, and not in the best way.
And Nathan, is this all Mariah, or is it just like All I Want for Christmas Is You, like the Christmas stuff, or is like,
Just
are you trying? Okay.
Well, just the Christmas stuff, but I'm also not like listening to Mariah Carey, the rest of her catalog on a regular basis. But it's the trigger is the Christmas. The trigger is are the Christmas songs.
This last couple of years must have been quite difficult for you then.
It's all right. We'll work through it. And that's all the time we have. We discussed the upcoming special election in New York's 3rd District. We talked about some old names in some new races. And we talked about the state of the Republican presidential primary. Thank you for joining us. We also have a little bit of news on the Inside Elections front. Our colleague, friend, and co-host Erin Covey is taking on a new role with our friends over at the Cook Political Report. So you'll be seeing some new faces here with Jacob and I on the Inside Elections podcast, and you can still read Erin's great work over at the Cook Report.
At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down key races and bring valuable context to complex elections. Go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. We've got individual subscriptions and group packages that are tailored for association and corporate PACs. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and rate us on your favorite platform. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment. If you don't like today's episode, please email Flo from Progressive. We also wanted to thank our producers, Alan Tuzinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and associate producer, Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us again next time.